Christmas Eve is supposed to be a time of warmth, of lights in dark windows, of families gathered around dinner tables, holding on to traditions that make winter feel less cruel. But on the night of December 24th, Lucy Clews was alone. The small house where she lived sat quietly under a pale winter sky. Outside, the street was empty. No laughter. No music. Just the distant hum of passing cars and the soft glow of Christmas lights flickering behind closed curtains. For Lucy, Christmas had not been the same since her husband's death. She had become a widow years earlier, a loss that reshaped every part of her life. Friends noticed how she had grown quieter, more reserved. Holidays, once filled with meaning, now carried a heavy silence. That night, nothing seemed unusual at first. Lucy was seen earlier in the day running small errands. She spoke briefly to a neighbor. She wished someone a polite, "Merry Christmas." Ordinary moments. The kind no one remembers. Until it's too late. As evening fell, Lucy returned home. What happened next would not be discovered until much later. When Christmas morning arrived, Lucy did not answer her phone. She did not open her door. And she did not appear anywhere she was expected to be. At first, people assumed she was simply spending the holiday quietly. After all, Lucy valued her privacy. She often kept to herself. No one immediately thought something was wrong. But as the hours passed, concern slowly turned into fear. By the time authorities were contacted, the sense of unease had settled deep. Inside that quiet home, a crime had already taken place. A crime that would transform a peaceful holiday into a lasting nightmare. This was not just a murder. It was the violent ending of a woman's final Christmas. A crime hidden behind closed doors, unfolding in silence, while the rest of the world celebrated. And at that moment, no one yet understood just how complex, and disturbing, this case was about to become. Because Lucy Clews was not simply a victim of circumstance. Her death would raise questions that lingered long after the decorations came down. Questions about trust. About vulnerability. And about how easily a life can be taken, when no one is watching. To understand this case, investigators first had to understand Lucy Clews herself. Lucy was in her early 40s at the time of her death. She was known as a private woman, polite, reserved, and deeply independent. She wasn't someone who drew attention to herself. In fact, many people later admitted they didn't know her as well as they thought they did. Years earlier, Lucy had lost her husband. The death was sudden and devastating. Those close to her described it as the moment her life quietly changed direction. She continued working, continued living in the same modest home, but something had shifted. The laughter came less often. The house felt emptier. Becoming a widow forced Lucy to rebuild her identity. She managed her life carefully. Bills were paid on time. Daily routines were followed. On the surface, everything appeared stable. But behind that stability was a woman carrying grief, loneliness, and a growing sense of vulnerability. Lucy did not remarry. She did not have children. Her world slowly became smaller. Neighbors remembered her as friendly but distant. Conversations were short. Smiles were polite. She valued her privacy, and she guarded it closely. Investigators would later learn that Lucy's isolation made her both strong and exposed. Financially, Lucy lived modestly. There were no signs of wealth, no obvious disputes over money. But she also had limited support. No one checking in daily. No one who would immediately notice if something was wrong. This detail would become critical. Because when a person lives quietly, their absence can go unnoticed, sometimes for far too long. Friends later recalled subtle changes in Lucy during the months leading up to her death. She seemed more cautious. More guarded. She spoke less about her personal life. She avoided details. At the time, no one thought much of it. Only after her death did these small details take on a darker meaning. Investigators began asking difficult questions. Was Lucy afraid of someone? Had she confided in anyone about feeling unsafe? Was there something happening behind closed doors that no one else could see? There were no clear answers. What police did know was this: Lucy Clews was not reckless. She did not live dangerously. She did not seek conflict. Which made what happened to her even more unsettling. Because whoever entered Lucy's life that final Christmas season did so quietly. Without drawing attention. Without leaving obvious warning signs. And that raised one terrifying possibility. The person responsible may have been someone Lucy trusted, or someone who knew exactly how alone she truly was. The first sign that something was wrong came from silence. On Christmas morning, Lucy Clews did not answer her phone. No return call. No reply to messages. At first, it didn't seem alarming. Lucy was known to keep to herself, especially during holidays. But as the day went on, concern slowly grew. By the following day, that concern had turned into fear. When authorities arrived at Lucy's home, the exterior told them very little. The house was locked. The windows were intact. There were no signs of forced entry. Once inside, officers were met with a chilling reality. Lucy Clews was found dead inside her home. The scene was quiet and contained, but unmistakably violent. There was no sign of a struggle that had spilled through the house. No overturned furniture. No broken doors. Whatever had happened appeared controlled, deliberate. Investigators immediately began documenting the scene. There were no obvious weapons nearby. No clear signs of forced entry. No immediate explanation for how the crime had unfolded. This raised troubling questions. Did Lucy know the person who entered her home? Had she willingly let someone inside? Or had the attacker found a way in without leaving a trace? The time of death was difficult to pinpoint. With no witnesses and no alarms raised during the night, investigators could only estimate that Lucy had been killed sometime late on Christmas Eve or during the early hours of Christmas Day. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. While families across the country celebrated, a woman had been murdered alone in her own home, unnoticed. Police canvassed the neighborhood. Most neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual. No screams. No sounds of struggle. Just the normal quiet of a holiday night. That silence would haunt the investigation. Inside the house, personal belongings remained untouched. There was no clear sign of robbery. This did not appear to be a random break-in. To detectives, the crime scene suggested something far more personal. Someone had entered Lucy's private space. Someone who felt comfortable enough to remain unseen. Someone who left behind questions instead of answers. As Lucy's home was sealed off and the investigation officially began, one thing became clear. This was not a simple case. And whatever truth lay behind Lucy Clews' final Christmas, it was carefully hidden. With the crime scene secured, the investigation into Lucy Clews' death began immediately. Detectives faced an uncomfortable reality: there were very few obvious leads. There were no signs of forced entry. No clear murder weapon. And no witnesses who had seen or heard anything unusual. In cases like this, investigators often start with the people closest to the victim. Lucy's personal life was examined carefully. Her phone records were reviewed. Her emails were searched. Her recent contacts were questioned. Anyone who had interacted with her in the weeks leading up to Christmas became a person of interest. But Lucy's quiet lifestyle made this difficult. She did not socialize often. She did not host guests. Her routine rarely changed. The list of potential suspects was short, and frustratingly vague. Police also explored the possibility of a robbery gone wrong. But nothing of value appeared to be missing. Lucy's personal belongings were still in place. There was no evidence of financial motive. This theory quickly lost credibility. Attention then turned to the idea of trust. Investigators began asking whether Lucy had allowed someone into her home voluntarily. Someone she recognized. Someone who did not raise her alarm. This possibility narrowed the focus. Detectives interviewed neighbors again, asking about visitors, unfamiliar vehicles, or unusual activity during the days before Christmas. Most reported nothing out of the ordinary. A few mentioned seeing a car parked briefly near Lucy's home, but details were unclear and inconsistent. Another line of inquiry centered on Lucy's vulnerability. As a widow living alone, she fit a profile that criminals sometimes exploit. But investigators struggled to connect her to anyone with a known history of violence. With no clear suspect, the investigation began to stall. Pressure mounted quickly. The holiday season meant fewer people were paying attention, but once news of the murder spread, public concern grew. Media outlets picked up the story, emphasizing the brutality of a crime committed on Christmas Eve. Police were expected to deliver answers. Behind the scenes, frustration was building. Every path seemed to lead to uncertainty. Every theory raised more questions than it answered. And yet, detectives were convinced of one thing. This was not a random act. Someone had targeted Lucy Clews specifically. Someone had entered her home without force. And someone had vanished into the holiday silence without leaving behind a clear trail. As the investigation continued, one uncomfortable truth became harder to ignore. The person responsible may have been closer to Lucy's life than anyone had first assumed. For weeks, the investigation into Lucy Clews' murder remained stuck in uncertainty. Detectives reviewed the same evidence again and again, searching for details that might have been overlooked. In cases like this, progress often comes not from new information, but from seeing old information in a different way. That moment came quietly. A routine re-examination of Lucy's phone and digital records revealed something investigators had initially underestimated: a pattern. Lucy had been in contact with someone she rarely mentioned to anyone else. The communication was subtle. Short messages. Infrequent calls. Nothing that immediately suggested danger. But the timing was significant. Several of these interactions had occurred in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Detectives shifted their focus. They traced the number, cross-referenced it with location data, and began building a clearer picture. The individual was someone Lucy had met through everyday circumstances, not a stranger in the traditional sense, but not a close friend either. Someone familiar enough to be trusted. Someone unnoticed enough to avoid suspicion. As investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. The person's account of their movements during the holiday period did not fully align with digital records. Cell phone pings placed them closer to Lucy's neighborhood than they had admitted. Surveillance footage from nearby streets showed a vehicle matching their description in the area on Christmas Eve. None of this alone was conclusive. But together, it formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. When confronted with the evidence, the individual's story began to unravel. Small contradictions turned into larger ones. Simple explanations became complicated. Calm confidence gave way to visible tension. Eventually, investigators uncovered the motive. What began as a seemingly harmless connection had grown into something darker. Control. Obsession. A desire that Lucy did not return. On Christmas Eve, that tension reached its breaking point. The person had gone to Lucy's home under the assumption they would be welcomed. When that expectation was challenged, the encounter escalated, quickly and violently. The crime was not planned in detail. But it was fueled by emotion, entitlement, and a dangerous inability to accept rejection. For detectives, the truth was devastating. Lucy Clews had not been targeted at random. She had been targeted by someone who believed they had a place in her life. And that realization changed everything. With the truth finally uncovered, the focus of the case shifted from investigation to accountability. An arrest was made, and the story of Lucy Clews' final Christmas moved into the courtroom. For many, this brought a sense of relief. After weeks of uncertainty, there was now a name attached to the crime. A person who could be held responsible. But justice, as it often does in true crime cases, came slowly. Legal proceedings stretched on, forcing Lucy's family and loved ones to relive the details of her death again and again. Each hearing reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. In court, prosecutors laid out the evidence carefully. Digital records. Location data. Contradictions in testimony. Each piece alone seemed small. Together, they told a clear story. The defense argued that the crime was not premeditated. That emotions, not intent, had driven the events of that night. But for the jury, the outcome was clear. Lucy Clews had trusted someone who did not respect her boundaries. That betrayal cost her life. When the verdict was delivered, it brought a measure of closure, but not peace. Because no sentence could restore what had been taken. Lucy's home was eventually sold. The decorations that once marked her last Christmas were gone. Life in the neighborhood returned to something resembling normal. But the impact of the case lingered. For investigators, Lucy's death became a reminder of how easily danger can hide behind familiarity. How crimes are sometimes committed not by strangers in the dark, but by people who believe they are entitled to someone else's time, attention, or affection. For the public, the case raised uncomfortable questions. How many warning signs go unnoticed? How often is quiet mistaken for safety? And how many lives are changed forever before anyone realizes what's happening? Lucy Clews is remembered not for the way she died, but for the life she lived, quietly, independently, and with dignity. Her final Christmas serves as a haunting reminder. That violence does not always announce itself. That trust can be weaponized. And that sometimes, the most dangerous moments happen when we believe we are safe. And as the case of Lucy Clews faded from headlines, one truth remained. Justice can punish the guilty. But it can never undo the silence left behind.